There's something about silence that makes me uneasy. Not the kind that falls between words, but the kind that hovers over places like a fog that refuses to lift. The town of Willowbrook, nestled in the Hudson River Valley, still wears its history like a starched collar, tight, proper, suffocating. In the spring of 1904, it was a model of aristocratic grace, a retreat for the families of lawyers, textile magnates, and retired judges. Its cobbled streets echoed with the clip of polished boots, and its homes sat shoulder to shoulder like gossiping matrons, neat and self-assured. But beneath all that civility, something lived, and it started, or perhaps only surfaced, in the stone basement of St. Matilda's School for Girls. St. Matilda's was the pride of Willowbrook. Founded in 1878 by Reverend Aldous Crane, it had a reputation for breeding young ladies into paragons of obedience, purity, and higher Christian intellect. Students came from as far as Philadelphia and Boston to wear the crested uniform and walk the ivy-choked halls. It wasn't the kind of place anyone questioned. If anything, people aspired to it. But by the winter of 1904, rumors began to seep from the cracks in the walls. Literal cracks, some said, beneath the chapel where the floorboards creaked in time with chants that no one could place. There were whispers, not loud, never shouted, but carried in the strained voices of maids, of laundresses, of gardeners who delivered vegetables and never returned. The kind of rumors that feel like dreams after a fever. One of those whispers landed on my desk at the New York Sentinel nearly a century later in a letter from a woman named Eleanor Greeley, who claimed her grandmother went missing beneath that school and that she still had a Bible that belonged to them, except the parts they didn't want God to read. At first I dismissed it. Urban legend. Guilt made myth. But Eleanor sent something else too, a photograph, browned and brittle. 4 girls in starched white, blank expressions. One of them had no eyes, just dark hollows carefully scratched out with something sharp. And there at the bottom corner, in faint ink, let none descend but the chosen, March 3rd, 1904. I couldn't look away. 3 months later, I found myself walking through the rusted gates of the abandoned school. Ivy now devoured its walls. The glass was all gone, but the foundation, the stone basement, was intact, cold, still, and wrong. In its shadows, I found a brass ring embedded in the floor, a latch, and stairs descending into something that did not feel like part of this world. But before we go down there, you need to understand what this town thought it was. I spoke with Dr. Miriam Cade, a local historian who spent years cataloging the private archives of Willowbrook. It was meant to be a sacred space, she told me, a kind of finishing school wrapped in faith. Reverend Crane was charismatic. They said he brought the light. He also brought silence, the kind that made people disappear politely. St. Matilda's enrollment book from 1904 shows 117 names, but graduation records from 1905 show 91. No investigation, no questions, just names that stopped being spoken. I also managed to retrieve 1 page of a ledger pulled from a fireproof safe unearthed during library renovations. It contains the list of weekly chapel sermons, and 1 entry is scratched out entirely. All that remains is a single word, penciled faintly in the margin, beneath. That's where we begin. If you asked anyone in Willowbrook in 1904 who the most respected man in town was, you would have heard a single name again and again, Reverend Aldous Crane. To some, he was a modern prophet, a gentle giant with soft eyes and a voice like polished wood. He arrived in Willowbrook in 1875 with nothing but a trunk, a walking stick, and a glowing letter of recommendation from a Presbyterian seminary in Rhode Island, one that no longer exists on any registry. By 1878, he'd raised the funds to build St. Matilda's, a boarding school for girls that promised a new vision of Christian refinement. No nuns, no harsh discipline, only light, guidance, and purification, as his inaugural speech stated, words that in hindsight feel more like a spell than a mission statement. I came across that speech, archived in the Willowbrook Historical Society's yellowed files, typed on a Remington in pristine alignment. At the bottom he signed it, "In light we wash the unclean, AC." The town adored him. Wealthy donors sent their daughters there. Politicians shook his hand. Mothers begged for an interview when a seat opened. His sermons at Willowbrook Chapel drew larger crowds than Christmas Mass. More than one parent wrote that Aldous Crane had lifted the fog of sin from their home. They meant it. I found a clipping from the Willowbrook Courier, dated August 1903. It features a photograph of the St. Matilda's faculty, all in formal dress. Reverend Crane stands at the center, hand resting on a student's shoulder. His expression is faintly smiling, but not his eyes. Something about the symmetry unnerves me. Everyone is perfectly posed, except for one woman, Miss Eleanor Larch, a teacher of classical literature according to the caption. She's standing slightly apart, as if caught mid-turn. Her expression tense, guarded, almost frightened. I'll return to her in a later chapter. Crane surrounded himself with a loyal, curated staff. Dr. Theodore Vail, the in-house physician, was a Cambridge-educated anatomist with a fascination for psychosomatic disorders. His notebooks would later reveal sketches of the girl's internal organs drawn from memory. No one asked how he knew. Headmistress Beryl Cobb was the strict but maternal face of the school. She oversaw discipline with an air of unshakable calm. In town, she was described as unsmiling but godly. In journals written by students and later recovered during the investigation, she was referred to as the mouthpiece, the one who opens the gate. To outsiders, though, the school was pristine. The annual garden showcase won regional awards. The girls were seen in town only under supervision, always walking in quiet pairs, wearing identical white gloves and navy coats. The same height, the same stride, the same silence. I interviewed Margaret Wexler, now 92, whose aunt was a chambermaid at the school in 1902. This was her account. They were always humming. The girls, under their breath, same tune, but no melody I knew, like a broken lullaby. The staff told us not to talk to them and never to go below the first floor after dusk. She also recalled cleaning Crane's study once and finding a stack of handwritten Bibles, each with torn pages. Not missing, torn, and always the same books, Leviticus, Ezekiel, and Revelation. I asked if she ever told anyone. Of course not. He was Reverend Crane. He was above us. If he tore pages from the Bible, it was because God told him to. That's the level of trust we're talking about. Willowbrook was hypnotized, and no one, not the mayor, not the police, not the parents, dared question the man who had built their town's greatest pride. But as I began to dig deeper, I started noticing something else, a pattern of transfers, girls whose families abruptly pulled them from the school. Records that list illness or emotional instability as the cause. I've so far confirmed 11 such departures between 1899 and 1904. None of those girls appear in any further public documentation. Not death notices, not marriage certificates, nothing. It's as if they were quietly erased. In her testimony before a state review board years later, Headmistress Cobb said only this: some were not strong enough to stay. Some had to be unremembered. The school had become a sanctified machine. Every face polished, every room locked, every Sunday service a ceremony of unity and purity. But the foundation, both spiritual and literal, was beginning to rot. You just had to listen closely. The trick with stories like this, stories wrapped in reverence and ritual, is that by the time you start seeing the cracks, it's already too late. There were signs, quiet ones, strange ones, but in Willowbrook, anything that didn't fit the narrative of grace was discarded like rotted fruit from a silver bowl, and the first signs came from the girls themselves. Let's begin with Lydia Parnell. She was 14 when she enrolled at St. Matilda's in the fall of 1903. Her parents, Edgar and Dorothea, were deeply religious, and their letters from that year describe her as a bright, if timid, child with a love of poetry and a habit of sleepwalking. The last letter Dorothea ever received from her daughter was dated November 9th, 1903. It arrived 3 weeks after Lydia had started at the school. It read, "Dearest Mother, the lessons are difficult but enlightening. We are learning how to fold ourselves in prayer so that no part of us is seen by Him. They say if we are silent long enough, We will hear the scratching beneath the word. I do not sleepwalk anymore. I do not sleep. Tell Father I have no need for mirrors now. They showed too much. In light, Lydia. That letter was never acknowledged by the school. 1 week later, the Parnells received a formal notice. Lydia had fallen ill due to improper spiritual preparation and would be transferred to a private retreat for restoration. No retreat was named. Lydia was never seen again. But her story wasn't unique. I found 4 other accounts, similar in nature, from families whose daughters either vanished or returned, altered. Sarah Burrows, age 12, was found in the school courtyard just before Christmas, barefoot in the snow, wearing her nightdress, speaking in tongues that no teacher could recognize. Her parents removed her from St. Matilda's and placed her in what was then called the Hudson Rest Asylum for Delicate Girls. According to her intake records, patient repeats the phrase, "He's under the steps" during episodes, shows compulsive behavior, scrubbing hands until raw, tearing pages from Bibles, fear of wood grain patterns. And then there were the sounds. I interviewed Henry Mallon, a retired groundskeeper whose father, Elias, worked the school's gardens from 1899 to 1904. Henry shared one of the few stories passed down before the family moved west. He said he once heard singing late at night coming from the stone chapel, said it wasn't hymns, not even Latin, just humming, slow and deep. He peeked in once, said the floor was open, like a trapdoor, and there were candles going down into it. But when he told Headmistress Cobb, she said it was part of a sacred lesson and not to speak of it again. Elias left that spring, no notice, just packed and went. The architecture itself seemed intentional. When I walked the crumbling ruins of St. Matilda's years later, I noticed the halls narrowed slightly the deeper you went toward the chapel, almost imperceptibly, just enough to make you uncomfortable. The stairs downward were uneven, the windows at odd heights, doors that opened into brick, and underneath the chapel, a brass fixture in the floor, shaped like a vesica piscis, an ancient Christian symbol, yes, but also an occult one, often tied to gates. The townspeople dismissed all of it. They clung to what they were told, that the girls were becoming pure, that the sounds were part of the method, that the ones who left were unfit for sanctity. No one wanted to consider that a school built on light could cast such a long, choking shadow. But the journals, buried in dust, hidden behind false walls, told a different story. In one small, tattered diary belonging to a girl named Beatrice Lang, age 11, there's a single passage that shook me. They said we were born unclean, and only the below can take it out. Sister Mary held my arms. The gate sang to us. There were ropes. Afterward, I could see nothing but red, but I was better. They said I was better. There's no further entry, and no school record of Beatrice Lang at all. So I went to the archives in Albany, and I found her birth certificate. I found her census record, but after 1903, she vanishes from every ledger. I believe she was one of the first to be unremembered. It's easy to mistake obedience for peace, silence for serenity, but in Willowbrook, silence was a mask worn by girls who forgot their names, by teachers who whispered to the dark, by a town that looked away, because looking would mean acknowledging what was always there. By early January of 1904, the gates of St. Matilda's had closed to the public, literally. The outer fence, once a waist-high wrought iron border adorned with lilies, was replaced with 7-foot-tall blackened bars, topped in jagged copper. The school cited safety from wild dogs, but no incident was recorded. Overnight, the front entrance was replaced with a gate that locked from the inside. Deliveries were rerouted. Produce and medical supplies were now dropped at the eastern edge of the property, beyond the tree line, where a heavy wooden box marked "Donations" awaited. Townsfolk noted that crates were removed by men in cloaks, not school staff, and only at night. The students were no longer seen in Willowbrook. I spoke with Mildred Cook, whose older sister Vivian had worked at the bakery near the school gates in 1904. Her recollection was clear, even after all these years. They stopped coming for bread in February. Before that, they'd walk down in threes, always threes, pale girls, all holding hands, never smiled, and then one day, gone, just gone. The Reverend came instead, paid in full, never said a word. Mildred also remembered the sound, a bell, faint and distant, ringing every night at exactly 11:11 p.m. for 15 nights in a row. Then silence. Then, on the 16th night, she said she saw a girl on the roof, just standing, in her nightgown, staring up. Then she knelt, but there wasn't anything there. I asked if she could be mistaken. She just said, "That school made you see things. That's why people stopped looking." Inside the school, things changed more drastically. Recovered letters from former teacher Eleanor Larch, found decades later in the false backing of a steamer trunk, reveal a horrifying descent into isolation and doctrine. One letter, addressed to an unnamed cousin in Rochester, reads, "The girls are no longer permitted to speak during meals, or walk alone, or look out the chapel windows. Reverend Crane has declared our voices must be held in preparation, as he says, stored like wine for the blood feast." I don't know what that means. The same letter includes a crude map of the school's basement levels, with one section circled in red and labeled only "The Room with No Name." We don't have photographs of that room, only sketches recovered from a student's hidden portfolio. They show a long corridor, stone-lined, ending in a door carved with a circle of thorns. The same symbol appears in the torn cover of one of the Bibles I was sent by Eleanor Greeley, the one with the missing pages. And the pages weren't just torn out. They were cut with surgical precision, replaced with handwritten passages in red ink, not verses, commands. One reads, "And if the soul be stained, thou shalt bind it in flesh, and offer it beneath the word, so that it may be purified in repetition." These weren't teachings, they were instructions. As the year wore on, contact with families diminished. A review of outgoing mail logs found in the estate of a deceased mail carrier shows a steady decline, from over 40 letters per week in autumn 1903 to only 3 by March 1904. Parents began to grow anxious, but were reassured by standardized reports sent from the school, all typed, all identical. "Your daughter is thriving in the light of sanctification. Do not worry, the world is no longer her home." By then, Dr. Vale, the school's physician, had ceased appearing in public entirely. Records show he requested formal excommunication from the Presbyterian Church, citing doctrinal realignment with internal revelation. What that meant is unclear. But an invoice from Castor and Rowe Medical Supply, dated April 2nd, 1904, lists an unusually large purchase: 18 yards of surgical gauze, 3 gallons of carbolic acid, 14 scalpels, 22 iron restraints, 1 mirrorless examination lamp. Each item billed to St. Matilda's Spiritual Center, sub-level inventory, sub-level, the basement, a place no student should have ever entered. And yet I found a testimonial buried in a forgotten transcript from a 1911 civil inquiry that includes a brief but chilling description from a former student, Alice Hennessy, who escaped the school at age 13. Her words, preserved in brittle ink, read, "They took us below for penance. We had to wear the veil. There was no light, only warmth and voices. We each held 1 page, and they said if we read it backward, we could be clean again. I pretended, but one girl read it aloud. She never came back. Who she was, we don't know." Alice was found months later, half naked in a thicket 10 miles north of Willowbrook, clutching a torn slip of paper with the word "judged" etched in what analysts later confirmed was her own blood. By April of 1904, even the staff had become sequestered. Students were left entirely under the guidance of Sister Mary Beth, a former nun turned liturgical instructor whose private writings reveal escalating zealotry. "The gate is near readiness. The girls have accepted silence. Their sins leak through their pores. We are nearly aligned." Aligned to what? That answer began to surface with a fall, a broken leg, and the girl who, for the first time in weeks, was taken outside the gates, alive and desperate to speak. Her name was Catherine Alder, age 13, a quiet girl, daughter of a steel broker from Albany, and the first student in over 5 months to leave the gates of St. Matilda's alive. It happened on April 17, 1904, around dusk. Catherine fell from the chapel balcony, or that's what they said. The balcony, as it stood then, overlooked the central atrium where daily prayer and meal blessings were conducted. According to the brief statement later submitted by Headmistress Cobb, Catherine suffered a fit of dizziness during devotion and lost her balance. A maid found her unconscious but breathing. What's odd is this. The balcony rail was over 4 feet high, and the girl was under 5. Cobb's report claimed she fell straight down. No impact against the chandelier, no blood on the railing, nothing that aligned with the medical injuries she would later be treated for. I located the original hospital admission log from St. Agnes Memorial, where she was admitted at 9:46 p.m. The attending physician, Dr. Helen Wexford, documented the following: compound fracture of the left femur, blunt trauma to ribs 3 through 7, lacerations consistent with binding across wrists and forearms, mild hemorrhaging behind both eardrums, no shoes, eyes dilated, highly reactive, pulse erratic, patient severely dehydrated. And then the final line, patient repeatedly utters the phrase, "Don't let them take my pages." Dr. Wexford notified authorities immediately. Catherine, once stabilized, began to speak, but only in fragments. Her voice was hoarse, her hands twitching involuntarily. What little she managed to convey was recorded by a night nurse, Joanna Bellefleur, whose journal I unearthed in a state archive storage facility mislabeled as religious artifacts, incomplete. April 18th, 1904, nurse's entry. She woke at 3:12 a.m., sat bolt upright, screamed 3 times, they said the gate would open if I bled on the word. They said it was his will, not ours. They took the other girls downstairs. I saw Sister Mary take out her tongue. There was a voice behind the wall. It knew my name before I did. Then she collapsed, unconscious by 3:19. Catherine slept for 36 hours after that. When police arrived the next day, they were met not with relief, but with resistance. Reverend Crane personally visited the hospital. He did not go to Catherine's room. He did not ask how she was. Instead, he met with hospital administrators behind closed doors. By morning, the medical report was sealed. The official diagnosis? Psychogenic fugue brought on by trauma and hysteria. Translation, she imagined it. But Nurse Bellefleur refused to let it go. She wrote, "They said she'd fallen, but how does a fall cause ligature marks and half-healed welts? That girl wasn't afraid of falling. She was afraid of being dragged back." Within 48 hours, 3 strange things happened. Catherine Alder was transferred to a rest home in Pennsylvania. No facility name was provided. Her family, according to the Willowbrook records, was no longer involved. Her mother died by suicide 6 months later. Her father left the country. Dr. Helen Wexford was quietly removed from her post. No public record of why. Nurse Bellefleur vanished. She clocked out at 7:03 p.m. on April 21st and was never seen again. Her apartment was found locked from the inside, the bed undisturbed. The only thing missing, her journal. The one I later found, decades later, in that mislabeled archive box. And what of St. Matilda's? Not a single student was withdrawn following the incident. No parents were contacted, no police interviews conducted. Headmistress Cobb wrote a brief letter to the Willowbrook Courier, assuring the public that the young lady's misfortune is being handled with grace and light. But that word again, light, always light, the kind of light that blinds. Yet not everyone accepted the explanation. Not everyone stayed silent. A junior reporter for the Hudson Herald, fresh out of Columbia, began digging. A young woman named Elsie Beckett. She wrote a brief column titled "The School of Quiet Girls," in which she questioned why no student had spoken to anyone outside the gates in over half a year. The column never ran. The publisher pulled it without explanation. Elsie was demoted, reassigned to cover bridge openings and church raffles, but she kept digging. And I believe she was the first person to start connecting the timelines, the vanishings, the sealed records, the patterns in the chapel hymns. She's the one who filed a freedom of worship inquiry with the state, though she was never credited. Her name was never on the paperwork. But I found her journal and her clippings. She never let go of the Catherine Alder case. In the final margin of one torn page, beneath a copy of a St. Matilda's graduation program, she wrote just 6 words: "They are building something below us." The first official inquiry into St. Matilda's wasn't led by the church, or the town, or even the families of the girls inside. It was led by a county health inspector named Gerald Lutz, who was assigned a routine inspection after a neighbor, name redacted, filed a complaint about a smell. That was the word used, smell. Described as a sweet rot, like dried blood and lilacs. The report was stamped April 28, 1904. Lutz arrived the next day. What's curious and telling is that he was never heard from again. I tracked down his personnel file in the Ulster County Archives. His inspection sheet lists the assignment: boarding institution, Willowbrook. No notes, just a dash. Then a single hand-penciled addition: access denied, sent away by clergy. Lutz never returned to the office. His personal effects were boxed and shipped to a brother in Buffalo, who later told a court clerk, "Gerald started speaking in riddles after that job. Said the floor was breathing." That would have been the end of it. One more name in a string of vanishings, if not for Elsie Beckett. Despite being sidelined at the Hudson Herald, she continued to track the case, secretly. She corresponded with a contact in Albany, Miriam Kovacs, a state records assistant with a photographic memory and a taste for conspiracy. Together, they began cross-referencing St. Matilda's student rolls with city death registries, asylum admissions, and boarding school transfer ledgers. What they uncovered was staggering. 19 names listed on St. Matilda's fall enrollment that never appear on any subsequent record anywhere. 6 reported deaths, all attributed to illness, with no autopsy or burial site. One name that appears twice in 2 different cities, 5 days apart, suggesting forged identity paperwork. Kovacs wrote in her private memorandum, "They're not losing students. They're recycling names, possibly even falsifying new girls. Something off about the birth dates. They're all born under waning moons." Why that detail? Why the lunar phase? We'll come back to that. Elsie attempted to present their findings to the Willowbrook Parish Board, who, on paper, oversaw the school, but she was met with blank stares. One member, Father Julius Harroway, reportedly told her, "It is not ours to question God's architects. They answer to a higher beam." The meeting ended abruptly, and then, 2 days later, Elsie was arrested for trespassing. Her charge? Crossing school grounds without cause after dusk. She was caught near the western wing, holding a satchel with a map, a lantern, and a copy of a student's torn journal. She was held overnight in Willowbrook jail. When questioned, she stated, "I heard the singing. I heard it beneath the chapel. It was not girls. It was deeper. It vibrated my teeth." She was released the next morning and quietly fired from the Herald. Her landlady reported that Elsie left town shortly after, leaving behind only one item in her room, a Bible. But not just any Bible, the Bible with missing pages. This is the one I now have, the one sent to me by Eleanor Greeley. Inside, the torn sections correspond to specific chapters: Leviticus 16, Ezekiel 8, and Revelation 9. Each of those passages, when restored in the proper order, forms a chilling sequence. Enter by blood and veil. The image detests the living. Seal the pit. 7 mouths speak. Only the chosen shall remain. These weren't devotional edits. They were instructions, possibly for a ritual. Despite Elsie's attempt to escalate the matter, no further investigation occurred. The diocese declined comment. The county deferred to private institutional rights, and Reverend Crane issued a public statement, still preserved in microfilm. St. Matilda stands as a beacon of God's glory. Those who spread doubt walk in shadow. The light does not explain itself. And yet, there was a tremor building in town, quiet, subtle, but real. A grocer refused to deliver bread. A laundress quit without notice. A letter to the editor appeared anonymously in the Courier reading, "They cover the windows now. I do not see the girls anymore, only figures." And once I heard one laugh. It was not a child's laugh. The town was beginning to whisper again, but no one was ready to confront what the whispers meant. Not yet. Because the real investigation, the one that mattered, would come from someone with nothing to lose. Someone outside the gates, but willing to step inside them. His name was Thomas Belgrave, and he didn't believe in monsters, not until he met the gates of St. Matilda's. Belgrave wasn't a journalist, a priest, or even a skeptic by nature. He was a state census auditor, a man who counted people for a living. He didn't chase stories, he confirmed numbers. Towns, farms, schools, orphans. No mythology, no bias, just facts. That's what made him dangerous. He came to Willowbrook in May of 1904 to finalize education statistics for the Hudson Valley District. The state required headcounts for budgeting. How many children, how many boarders, how many orphans were enrolled in institutions of faith or corrective purpose? St. Matilda's listed 118 active students in their last annual report. But Belgrave could only find 99 names in the diocesan education registry. He assumed it was clerical error. It often was. But his policy was clear. Discrepancies larger than 10 required in-person verification. So he knocked on the gate. I found his travel journal in the state archive. It's meticulous, structured, almost clinical. But then there's a shift. May 14th, 1904, Willowbrook. School grounds poorly maintained. Girls not visible. Greeted at gate by a woman. Headmistress. No introduction offered. Refused entry. Offered tea at parlor window. Denied request to verify enrollment. She claimed, "All are accounted for in ways you do not measure." That same entry includes something peculiar. Heard humming during conversation. Repetitive. Low pitch. Same 4 notes. Seemed to come from beneath floorboards. Unexplained vibrations. Teeth ached. He tried again the next day. This time Reverend Crane appeared in person. Belgrave's notes described Crane as articulate, imposing and warm in voice but emotionally flat. Crane offered him a pre-written statement confirming the full enrollment. No signatures, no student names, just numbers. Belgrave, uncomfortable but still skeptical, returned to town and began what he called a cross-registry audit. He compared St. Matilda's past graduates with county vital records. What he found confirmed what Elsie Beckett had already begun to suspect. Students were being duplicated. He found a Maria Hollenbeck, supposedly age 15, enrolled in 1902, but she also appeared in a burial record in Yonkers, dated 1899. Same name, same birth date, same parents. 2 identical girls, 3 years apart. Impossible. Another girl, Edith Lorne, appeared in the 1901 enrollment list but was simultaneously listed as absent, presumed dead in an 1896 ferry sinking. Again, identical identifiers. Belgrave's entry from May 20th, "This is no clerical issue. These girls existed before they were students, and then, somehow, after." He took his findings to the State Office of Institutional Oversight. They told him the school had religious autonomy and that unless children were being harmed or went missing, no action could be taken. But Belgrave didn't stop. He traveled to 3 towns in upstate New York, looking for parents of enrolled students. He found only one who agreed to speak, Mrs. Corinne Delaney, mother of Annabel Delaney, who had withdrawn due to spiritual fatigue, according to the school's records. Only she hadn't. Mrs. Delaney broke down during the conversation. She told Belgrave that she'd been refused all contact with her daughter since February. Her letters returned unopened, her phone calls unanswered, and she shared something else. Annabel kept drawing the same thing before she left, a staircase, stone walls, and a circle of thorns. She said it was where they made them empty themselves. I don't know what that means. I just know she wasn't my daughter anymore when she stopped writing. Belgrave, now convinced that something was deeply wrong, returned to St. Matilda's one final time. He never made it to the door. Instead, he went to the abandoned church next door, once used for overflow sermons. From there, he could see the western wing of the school. He set up a small spyglass in the bell tower. His final journal entry, dated May 23, 1904, reads, "Saw procession of 7 girls, robed in white, faces covered, walked in a circle around chapel foundation, candles in hand, shadow behind them, tall, too tall, thought it was crane but shape inconsistent. One girl collapsed, others did not stop, circle completed, door below chapel opened, all entered. There is a door beneath the chapel, and they are using it." He sketched the scene. It's still in the archive. Beneath the sketch, one final line. What they're doing isn't education, it's ritual containment. That night, Belgrave wired a telegram to Albany requesting emergency intervention. It never arrived. 2 days later, his body was found floating in the Hudson River, ruled a suicide. But here's what they didn't expect. He had mailed his journal separately to his brother, Edwin Belgrave, a postal clerk in Brooklyn. Edwin never went public, but he passed the journal to Eleanor Greeley, the granddaughter of one of the missing students. That's how I found it. It took the death of a man with no dog in the fight to open the first real crack in the school's wall of silence. And through that crack came something worse than suspicion, the first glimpse of a system. Because what St. Matilda's was hiding wasn't random, it was patterned, ritualized, and it was accelerating. It begins, as most unravelings do, with paperwork. When you peer into the back office organs of a place like St. Matilda's, you expect a certain level of order, birth certificates, class rolls, medical histories. But what I found tucked in the state's forgotten storage vault under private religious institutions, discontinued, was a stitched-together illusion. Some of it was carefully forged. Other parts were simply invented. A name repeated twice, under 2 different birthdays. The same photograph used for different students with hair and eyes darkened by pencil. Parents that didn't exist. Others who had died years before their daughters were supposedly enrolled. This was not clerical error. It was a reconstruction of identity, an artificial census. And more telling than what was there was what wasn't. Out of the 118 students supposedly enrolled in 1904, 34 had no medical records, not even the mandatory state vaccinations required by law. 17 had no recorded place of birth, and 9 were listed only by first name, as if plucked out of nowhere. 1 was simply recorded as Agatha, claimed by the blood. This wasn't a school. This was a preparation site, and the lie, once poked, unraveled fast. I obtained private notes from Sister Eleanor Larch, the same former literature teacher who had attempted to write her cousin in Rochester. Hidden in the lining of her Bible, sewn into the cloth itself, were 3 torn pages labeled Liturgical Deviations, Internal Use Only. They describe something not found in any official doctrine. Stage 1, the quieting, days 114. Students are to be silenced through reflective scripture, fasting, and rhythmic exposure to the gate verses. Tongues are trained for reversal incantations. Stage 2, the binding, day 15. Girls are placed in the vessel room for baptismal bloodletting. Cloth veils must be worn, vain readings to be taken, only the unsullied may proceed. Stage 3, revelation, date determined by moon and scripture alignment, unveiling conducted by spiritual leader. Flesh to be prepared, voices offered, gate approached. These weren't spiritual exercises, they were ritual preparations. Eleanor wrote, "I have taught Shakespeare and Milton. I have watched these girls quote them backward until their mouths bled. This is not God's house." In that same Bible, taped between Psalm 119 and Proverbs, was a map, not of the school's upper levels, but the basement. A winding labyrinth beneath the chapel, narrow corridors, rooms labeled with names like the Hollow Tongue, the Pit of Reversal, and one simply called Chancel D. In the center, a chamber shaped like a Vesica Pisces, just like the brass carving embedded in the chapel floor. Inside it, the word gate. By now, the whispers in town had grown louder. People claimed to hear chanting beneath the soil. Maids resigned mid-shift. Gardeners refused to approach the western wing. One milkman allegedly dropped his pail and ran screaming after seeing a girl's face in the window, except the face was upside down. Still, nothing official happened until someone leaked the map. It was mailed anonymously to the Albany Journal, along with a torn page from a girl's diary, soaked in a dark, rust-colored stain. The handwriting read, "They told me I was born for the offering, but my bones are tired of kneeling. If I am chosen, may God shut his eyes." The editorial team, unsure if it was a hoax, declined to print the story, but one staffer, Daniel Roque, took it to an old contact in the governor's office. The page made its way to Special Agent Carl Donovan, who had been investigating rumors of ritual activity tied to missing minors. Donovan filed a preliminary case brief. Portions of it were released posthumously. It reads, "St. Matilda's School appears to be engaged in coordinated religious rites involving minor children, possible blood rituals, and the falsification of identities to obscure institutional numbers. Strong indication of organized theological deviation, possibly cult-like in structure." And then, buried at the bottom of the report, 5 words: "Pattern matches with prior incident, Rochester, 1871. That incident, the Ashvale Orphan Circle. A case buried by the church where 6 children were consumed by fire after allegedly initiating a ritual based on altered scripture and mirrored chanting. Reverend Aldous Crane had been present as a seminarian. That's when it all locked into place. Crane wasn't a rogue preacher. He was part of something older, something hidden. Elsie Beckett, in her final letter to Miriam Kovach before disappearing, wrote, "They've been trying to open it since Ashvale. The Bible isn't missing pages. It's being rewritten. The gate isn't a door, it's a mirror, and they're building it with girls. There is a word, whispered only in the margins of doctrine, that doesn't appear in any canon. Not in Latin, not in Hebrew, not even in the Apocrypha. The word is Thuniel." It was scrawled in charcoal ink on the back cover of a hand-bound prayer book found beneath a loose brick in St. Matilda's chapel, alongside dried rose petals and 3 small teeth. The page was torn again from the Book of Revelation, but the ink was overlaid with symbols that don't belong to any recognized Christian or esoteric tradition, except one. I sent the prayer book to a colleague of mine, Dr. Peter Lessing, a theological semiotician and retired Vatican archivist. When he returned it, he included a single note: "These markings resemble what we recovered from the Ashvale fire site. Same rhythm, same order, and the same omission. No cross, only the gate." The belief system behind St. Matilda's wasn't just heretical, it was engineered, piece by piece, symbol by symbol, cobbled from scripture and psychosis, and at its heart was a man who believed that God had abandoned order and that purity could only be reclaimed by repetition of sacrifice. That man was Reverend Aldous Crane. His private journal, discovered in 1933 beneath a false floor in the rector's quarters, is now preserved in state archives. Most of it is unintelligible, scrambled scripture, drawings of eyes without lids, girls standing in rings, mouths agape, with pages shoved inside, but certain passages appear again and again. Only the unknowing may speak backward. The word must be cleaned of light. The pit beneath the chapel sings in her name. She is Thuniel, mother of reversal. Her mouth is made of names. Her tongue is ash. That name, Thuniel, comes up 16 times. The doctrine, stitched together through Larch's leaked notes, Crane's journals, and the torn Bibles, can be distilled into 4 core beliefs. 1. Purity is inversed through knowledge. To learn the Bible forward is vanity. To recite it backward, in parts without comprehension, is surrender. The girls were taught to chant verses in reverse order, then with the words reversed, and finally with syllables deconstructed. Not understanding it was the point, because understanding brought pride. And pride is sin. 2. The flesh must forget itself. The girls underwent bindings, rituals of deprivation, darkness, and silence. Food was withheld, names were forbidden, hair was shaved beneath veils. It wasn't punishment, it was erasure. A page in Sister Mary Beth's notes reads, "Once they forget their names, the gate will whisper one of its own." 3. The gate requires mirrored offerings. Every ritual involved symmetry, two girls facing each other, speaking the other's name until it became meaningless. A student diary fragment found near the ruins mentions, "She said I was her and she was me. We held the knife together. We bled the floor. It felt like being looked at from behind my eyes." 4. The sacrifice is not death, it is containment. Contrary to what we might expect, most victims weren't killed outright. They were prepared, hollowed, and hidden. According to a theory proposed by Lessing, the belief was that only those without identity could stand before the word gate and survive. They were not murdered. They were made into vessels, living scrolls. If that sounds insane, that's because it is. But this belief had structure, routine, tools. There were documented roles in the rituals. The mouthpiece spoke only during reversal chants. Often the headmistress. The veiler covered the children before descent, likely Sister Mary Beth. The binder prepared the body. This may have been Dr. Vale, the architect, the only one allowed to open the floor, always Crane. And there was a fifth role, mentioned only once, in blood-red ink on the back of a child's drawing. The key. No name, no face, just, "The key will come at the blood moon. She will not cry, she will be opened." Was this a prophecy, a plan, or worse, a rotation? You see, this wasn't a one-time event. These rites were performed over years, perhaps decades, and each time a girl was unremembered, officially transferred, spiritually purified, legally vanished. They weren't just worshipping something, they were feeding it memory. I believe the rituals were a form of inversion theology, a belief that the Word of God had been corrupted by human interpretation and that the only way to return to the pure tongue was to speak it backward through the unknowing inside a hollowed vessel. A girl, a child, a soul clean of will. Crane's final sermon, found in transcript form in Eleanor Greeley's family records, ends with this line, "And when the final page is eaten, she will rise, not to condemn the living, but to rewrite them." It was July 3rd, 1904, a Sunday. The air in Willowbrook hung hot and heavy, thunder pressing behind the clouds. The kind of day where the town might have looked peaceful to a passerby, flags on porches, hymns leaking from chapel doors. But across the woods, behind the wrought iron fence of St. Matilda's School for Girls, the peace was a lie. And that afternoon, the door was finally kicked in. The raid was authorized by Special Agent Carl Donovan, who, after cross-referencing Belgrave's census discrepancies with the forged identities recovered by Miriam Kovac, secured an emergency federal order under the Child Welfare Integrity Act, a rarely enforced statute buried deep in 19th century federal law. He arrived with 7 men, a mix of agents and constables from 3 counties, armed with revolvers, torches, and an order to enter by force if refused. They were refused. The headmistress, Beryl Cobb, answered the door and said simply, "You are not welcome in God's womb," and then she shut it. Donovan signaled his men. The door was rammed open with a crash, and what they found inside, no students, no teachers, just silence. The entire first floor was deserted, candles still burning, food untouched on platters in the dining hall. The paintings had been turned toward the wall, mirrors smashed, every window draped in black cloth. It didn't look abandoned, it looked prepared. According to Donovan's final field report, a stench of salt and rust pervaded the halls. Sound was muffled, like walking through wet linen. Found children's shoes lined neatly outside the chapel, 42 pairs. Then they entered the chapel. Inside, the altar had been dismantled, the cross removed. In its place was a carved circle of thorns embedded into the floor. Beneath that, the brass ring I found decades later. They pried it open. What they found was not a cellar, not storage, not foundation. It was a chamber of stone, descending in a slow spiral, walls covered in scripture written backwards, etched with fingernails, in blood and ink. Every 10 feet, A sconce holding a candle burned to its nub, and at the bottom, the Vesica room. Agent Matthew Kint, one of the few to survive, wrote in his personal letter, "The floor was wet, but there was no water, just warmth. The walls pulsed. Something was carved into the center, a woman's face, upside down, mouth open, eyes closed. Pages had been stuffed into her mouth, torn Bible leaves, all from Leviticus and Revelation. But that wasn't the worst of it. Lining the walls of the room were alcoves, 12 in total. Inside 11 of them, agents discovered girls, alive, barely, naked but for veils tied to their jaws, eyes burned shut with ash, hands bound behind their backs. They were humming, all in unison, a 4-note chant, the same rhythm Belgrave described in his notes. They were removed one by one. Only 6 survived beyond the first hour. One girl, no older than 12, had the word vessel carved into her chest with meticulous care. Another had been sewn closed at the lips. And in the 12th alcove, a journal, bound in human skin, written in the hand of Reverend Aldous Crane. It ended with a single line, "The key has not yet opened, but the gate is near breath." Crane was nowhere to be found. Headmistress Cobb and Sister Mary Beth were arrested at the Western Wing, mid-ritual, attempting to light the palms of a girl who had already passed. They offered no resistance. Cobb simply muttered, "She is not coming. We were impure. We were impure." Inside Dr. Vale's medical office, authorities found a collection of soul charts, mapping girls' psychological weaknesses, 8 glass jars of extracted teeth, a row of scalpels carved with scripture, and a mirror that reflected nothing at all. The school was shut down within 24 hours. Every item catalogued, every passage documented. But many of the girls, those who lived, could no longer speak. Some had no memory of their names. Others screamed when shown sunlight. And the journal, the one with the cult's ritual logic, it vanished, disappeared from evidence within a week. Officially, no such book was recovered, but I've seen pages from it, preserved by one of the surviving agents who fled to Oregon and lived under a false name. He left them in a safety deposit box, along with a note. The gate didn't open, but something breathed, and I think it's still exhaling. The building was burned to the ground in August of 1904, ordered by the diocese for cleansing purposes, but the foundations remain. I've been there, and the brass ring is still visible, darkened, rusted, and half buried in ivy. But it's there, waiting, because whatever they were trying to summon, whatever they were offering those girls to, it wasn't done. The trials began in October of 1904, but to call them trials is misleading. They were rituals in their own right, not of justice, but of erasure, of silence, of selective memory wrapped in decorum. There were no public hearings, no open court. Everything was held in sealed ecclesiastical review panels under the justification of protection of minors and spiritual integrity. No names of the girls were released, no press was allowed inside, but I've seen the transcripts. They were buried in an off-site diocesan storage vault in Saratoga County, mislabeled Abbey Donations, 1901-1909. It took me 2 years to find them, and when I did, they reeked, literally, of mildew, soot, and something else, something like iron. Inside, the testimonies of 6 survivors are recorded, their names redacted, their identities replaced with single-letter pseudonyms, E, J, M, R, A, and S. What they describe is not linear, it's fragmented, but the fragments tell the story. They tied pages to our tongues. We had to taste the verses until they were sweet. E. I was the left side. She was the right. We folded our fingers into each other. When they cut her, I felt it. J. The voice in the wall said my name 3 days before I knew how to speak it. That's how I knew it was real. M. 4 of the girls were placed in a rest facility near Poughkeepsie, St. Asherah's, for the morally disturbed, a euphemism if ever there was one. All were diagnosed with severe delusional religious trauma and somatic dissociation, in modern terms, conversion disorder and catatonic PTSD. Two of the girls died within a year, one from spontaneous internal hemorrhage, the other from self-immolation using flammable oils, despite being confined to a padded room with no known access to accelerants. That girl was S. She left one note behind, scratched into the wall using a spoon. She's in the syllables, but not all the girls vanished. One survived well into the 1980s under a new identity, Annabelle Delaney, though that was not her name by then. She married, had 2 children, and once, after being interviewed by a local historian researching the Willowbrook fires, left a letter on their desk. No return address, no signature, just a warning. The humming isn't in the chapel, it's in the prayers you say without meaning them. As for the perpetrators, Headmistress Beryl Cobb was deemed mentally unfit to stand trial. She was committed to a monastery-run asylum in Vermont, where she died in 1912, mute, having bitten off her own tongue. She left behind no writings. Her final act was to trace a circle into her bedding every night before sleep, Sister Mary Beth confessed, willingly, smiling. "We were vessels for the vessel," she said. "They said we were stones to build the altar. The girls, they were the hymns." She was sentenced to 20 years in solitary confinement, but records show she never made it to the prison. The transport carriage overturned en route under mysterious circumstances. Her body was never recovered. Dr. Vale died before charges could be filed. He was found hanging in the bell tower, dressed in surgical whites, eyes removed with surgical precision. On the wall beside him, written in something brown, "I cannot witness what must be unseen." And Reverend Aldous Crane, gone, disappeared into myth. There were Crane sightings for years afterward, rumors of a man preaching mirror-language sermons in roadhouses across upstate New York, a figure leaving Bibles with reversed pages in chapel pews, a tall man seen humming in graveyards, but he was never found. At the federal level, the incident was sealed under the Religious Anomalies Act of 1905, a rarely used statute originally designed to suppress pagan uprisings in isolated Appalachian sects. The official summary: no sufficient evidence of systemic abuse beyond the spiritual practices of the time. Injuries attributed to mass hysteria and religious fervor. All victims reassigned. Reassigned. That word still haunts me, because what it meant was simple. They closed the book, they turned the page, and they forgot. But not everyone did. Eleanor Greeley, whose grandmother, Beatrice Lang, was among the missing, spent her life building a private archive, collecting documents, maps, stained pages, and names no one dared say out loud. When I asked her why, she said, "Because I have a daughter. And I don't care how many laws are passed, how many chapels are condemned, something still hums beneath that ground." I heard it once on a field trip, when I walked past the place where the altar used to be. I was 8, and I swear to you, Mr. Harrow, something whispered my name. The school is gone, that's what they say. St. Matilda's burned in the late summer of 1904, reduced to a blackened skeleton of brick and twisted iron. The official cause was faulty gas lamps, though no gas lines were ever recorded on the property. Firefighters said it was the kind of fire that seemed to start in the walls, not the hearth. All that remains is foundation stone, now cloaked in ivy and moss, sunken into the trees behind what is today a wildlife preserve. The only trace of what once stood there is a patch of scorched soil shaped like a crescent, unnatural in its curve. Locals refer to it simply as the Circle. No one builds near it, but some still visit. A former school teacher named Ruth Ansell, now 73, walks there every July 3rd with a bouquet of white lilies and a page from Leviticus tucked into her sleeve. She won't say who the flowers are for. She will only say this: some girls were taken, some girls were made to stay, but the rest of us, we were built around it like scaffolding. We carry it. She was never enrolled at St. Matilda's, but her mother was. The more I looked into the surrounding decades, the more I saw echoes, patterns repeating like an old song. In towns miles away, girls with matching scars, choir schools that closed without explanation, Children who whispered the same four-note hum in sleep studies. In 1972, a Catholic orphanage in upstate Vermont reported 3 separate incidents of children found chanting passages in unison without instruction. When I visited in 2023, one of the staffers handed me something, an old drawing recovered from a flooded filing cabinet, a circle of thorns, a veiled girl, a gate with eyes. In 1998, a psychotherapist in Ithaca published a private case study on a young patient who spoke fluent biblical Aramaic in her sleep, though her family was entirely secular. In one of her trance sessions, she repeated the phrase, "I am not the key, but I am what's left of her." The therapist, unaware of the St. Matilda's case, simply labeled it religious delusion, variant 3B. We tell ourselves these stories are over. We tell ourselves we've burned the past, that ash has no memory, that truth dies in trial. But trauma doesn't operate that way. It seeps, it mutates, it adapts. Just ask Eleanor Greeley. She died in 2004, exactly 100 years after the raid of natural causes. Her granddaughter found her journals neatly stacked on her desk. On top, a note. If they ever start humming again, don't listen, not even once. There's a memorial now, a circle of stones, set by local volunteers who believed the girls deserved a name, even if their names had been taken. There's no plaque, no cross, only a single etching in the center stone. We remember the unremembered. Every year, on July 3rd, people gather. Not many. Some carry flowers, others carry silence. A few bring pages from damaged Bibles and lay them face down. And always, without fail, someone brings a mirror just to make sure it reflects back. Because in the end, the Macabre record is not just about the crimes that were hidden. It's about what happens when the people we trust, preachers, teachers, caretakers, become architects of horror under the banner of salvation. It's about how we forget, how we look away, how we explain the screaming by calling it a hymn. And it's about the girls who were told they were unclean, who were twisted into vessels, who were used, erased, rewritten. They were never just victims. They were scripture to something dark. We owe them our memory, because sometimes the most trusted people are the ones we should have feared most. Daniel Harrow, The Macabre Record.